All right, good morning, welcome. Thank you for taking your time this morning, joining me here for an hour on the Windows ADK 10, and I'll also touch in on a lot of the Windows setup changes and also how Windows ADK 10 actually integrates with both MDT and Config Manager, because after all, it is a plumbing tool that is intended to not be seen and been hidden in the background. But for troubleshooting purposes and to learn about what's going on behind the scenes, you actually do need to know the tools as well. So this is what the session is about. And as usual, I will happily accept questions through Twitter as well, and also questions, if you have any, just out with them, I'll be happy to answer. If you tag the questions with NICconf and my name or my alias on Twitter, I have at least a chance to actually find it quickly, and I'm using this laptop here to view the NICconf stream. And of course, this is me. I've been doing deployment for a long, long time. Started when I was 16, been doing it ever since. Used to go down to a local computer shop after school, after the gymnasium in Sweden, well, high school, kind of, and help them assemble computers. That's how I started my career. And of course, they had to be deployed. So we had a Novell 2 or 3 server something. We downloaded floppy disks from it, or connected a floppy disk and downloaded the stuff from it. So that was early deployment. Now it's different. I work for Knowledge Factory. We used to be a small company, 35 people, but this summer something interesting happened. We got acquired by another company, so overnight I got like 1,100 coworkers. Haven't quite learned the name yet, but I'm getting there. So now it's Advania, but we still have the Knowledge Factory part of that. This is where I live, in the middle, not on the beach, but close to the beach. I live in Halmstad in Sweden, on the west coast. And when I don't do consulting work, I author books. There is a Windows 10 deployment book available, and I do presentations, trainings, sessions like this. I think it's fun. It's interesting, this whole thing of doing public sessions. I figured that either you like it or you pretty much hate it. There is an urban legend. I'm not sure if it's true. But in the US, according to this legend, there was a study being made about public speaking and being afraid of it, yes or no. And public speaking came higher on the things they were afraid of than dying. So I thought that was funny. Anyway, Windows 10 deployment, if you know Windows 7, if you know Windows 8 deployments, you're in a good shape, because Windows 10 doesn't change dramatically. They add more stuff, yes, but they don't remove anything. So you still deploy Windows 10 the same way, you still have the Vim images, and you can still do VHD deployments as well. VHD deployments is typically what you will do in data center for virtual machine manager kind of deployments and VDI solutions. But you can also boot from it, of course. You can have a physical machine, you can take your Windows 10 image, you can apply it to the virtual disk, and you can simply copy that virtual disk over to the machine. So when you do a directory listing, you see a single file, and that's the VHD file, and then you simply configure the bootloader on the machine so you can boot from it. So you don't need to worry about this dual partitioning stuff just because you want to have a dual boot. You can have 4 or 5 different VHD files side by side on the same volume and simply pick and choose which one you would like to boot from. That's still available in Windows 10 and of course Windows 8 as well. One benefit of doing that is that you actually can undo things. Because when you create this VHD file, you can actually create a master and a child, parent-child. And you can boot from the child. And everything that is being written is obviously written into that child. Then you can reboot the machine, get rid of the child, spawn a new child, and boot from that one. So effectively doing an undo, something you would like use in a checkpoint or a snapshot in a VM, but you can do that on physical hardware because of the boot from VHD option. Offline servicing haven't changed. I mean, it came with Windows Vista back in the days. But there is a difference in how many updates you actually need to apply these days. there is at most, at any given time for Windows 10, you only need to apply 2 updates to be up to date. So if you guys installed Windows 10 when it came back in July last year or early August if you did the enterprise versions, and you basically turn off that machine and you locked it down in a closet for a while, and then today in February you boot it up, you can apply a single update together with a servicing stack update, and that machine will now be fully up to date. And since it's only 2 updates, of course you can do offline servicing of those. Do not even try to do offline servicing on Windows 7. 300 updates about now. You do not want to download them one by one and have a script inject them offline. You will break that image, guaranteed. Do it online instead. It's okay to inject like 10 or 15 hotfixes, I don't mind, but for Windows 10 it's so much easier. The updates are cumulative. The downside is you can't pick and choose anymore. You either get them all or you get none. So just hope that Microsoft does a proper testing of the updates these days, because you don't have an option to uninstall something. You have to uninstall the whole shebang if that's needed. There was a change in Windows 10 though, and that is the provisioning packages. The ability to create or bundle together settings, files, assets, certificates, configurations into a single package that you can apply to a machine. It's not yet directly integrated with the deployment solutions like MDT and Config Manager, but this is intended for the following scenario. You go down to a local computer shop or whatever you buy computers at, and you buy, say, a Surface. And that Surface is configured with Windows 10 Professional. And it has nothing of your environment in it. It's just a clean install from, well, Microsoft in this case. You create a package that will upgrade it to the enterprise version, that will install your certificates. It will join your domain. It will put them into the right OU. It will enroll it for whatever services you want to enroll it into, Intune, Config Manager, whatever. Install apps, run scripts, do settings, set a computer name according to your standard. You bundle all that into a package and you simply install that package. And that will convert that bulk-based or bulk-purchased machine into a corporate device. So if you trust the Microsoft image that is on there, if you trust the vendor image that is on there, of course you can do that as well. So that's the intended scenario for provisioning packages. And Windows To Go is still around for Windows 10. I don't see that being used much at all. The intention is that you have your Windows installation on a USB stick and you run it from there. It was cool when it came, but I've seen very few organizations actually using it for large-scale deployments. Now, whoops, that was the wrong. Have to go the other way. The setup hasn't changed either. The only thing they did add is you can actually install provisioning packages during setup XE processes as well. And I will show you why that's important a bit later on, because Microsoft are doing some pretty cool things for the user state migration tools. They can do much more now in Windows 10 than I could ever before Windows 10. Now, when you run Windows 10 setup, you take a machine, you boot it or mount a media on it, Windows 10 media. So I'm going to mount a Windows 10 Enterprise, something that was XP, and 1511 media, and I boot from it. It still starts WinP, it's WinP 10. And as usual, when setup XE is starting the environment, at any given time you can press Shift F10 to get a command prompt. Has been available for a while, about 17 years, was introduced with NT4, the graphical portion of the NT4 setup. But I can continue, obviously, and start my setup XE. This is not how you deploy Windows 10. This is not how MDT and Config Manager does it. But this is how provisioning packages does it. So if you want to use all the features that are available in the provisioning package, then you need to run setup, which none of the deployment solutions does, except for one scenario, and that is the in-place upgrade, which is running setup. The reason I show you this is because if you go to my blog, I have a post I uploaded a while ago while Wicked was still in beta, provisioning packages was still in preview, beyond something, you can search for that. Beyond basic Windows 10 provisioning packages. I haven't yet figured out if this is a good or a bad thing, but it's interesting enough to think about at least. In the Windows 10 ADK, there is a new version of ScanState, which drives the normal backup of things, use empty backup. And it has some new switches, apps into a package. It works like the following. You install a reference image in a VM. You do all the settings you want it. You install all the applications you want in it. So basically, you have a machine that you're happy with. Then you run this command, and it will rip away Windows from that VM and create a package of everything else. All your settings, all your apps, the installed apps, as they are, and create a package of it. And that package may end on a ppkg extension, but it's not a ppkg file, it's a Vim file. You can mount it 7-zip, or you can mount it using ImageX or DISM or mount Windows Image, or whatever you use to mount Vim files with. And then you can have setup install this package when you deploy new machines. So it's a whole new different way of thinking of reference image. It's a reference image, yes, but it's only without Windows. So then you take a brand new Windows ISO that you download from Microsoft, any version, any build, and you apply this package to it during setup. But you have to run setup exe to do that. None of MDT and Config Manager can currently do that for you. But at least, I think it's interesting enough to know about. Let me just open up my notes real quick. I don't forget anything. That will be sad. All right. The other scenario where we run setup is obviously when we do in-place upgrades. And when you do that, setup is run different. So if I mount an ISO, can you please wake up? Same here, mount an ISO, Windows 10, 1511. Open up a command prompt to run this command. This drives the setup. As I mentioned in many of my other sessions, there is a switch that you can add that will perform a simulation of the setup. So you can figure out if Windows will actually run, if the upgrade will actually work without having to do one. The downside is it actually spits out some pretty nasty information in the log files. It's not too obvious to see what it is, but luckily there are people who know how to read log files out there, and Michael Niehaus is one of them. So scan only. He goes under the nickname Knowledge House internally at Microsoft because he basically knows everything there is to know about setup. But he put together a blog post that explains how to read that log file. Basically, what to look for to try to find out why Windows 10 could not run through that upgrade. And I was having a chat with Kent, who was having the session here before me this morning. They actually did something extremely clever. Don't tell Kent I said that, but it is. They put together a PowerShell script So they push out the sequencing config manager that runs the setup with the switch. It's a default action now in the config manager upgrade sequence. And then they have a PowerShell script that parses the log files for this type of information on every client that they run that sequence on. And they store that back in a database on the server so that you immediately get a view of all your machines in your network, how well they will actually accept an in-place upgrade of Windows 10 without having to do an in-place upgrade of Windows 10. So that's pretty cool. So if you bug Kent about it, he can probably, or hopefully, share that information with you. But it's a nice way of doing it. Figure out beforehand. Now, back to the ADK. After all, that's the session title. ADK, as I mentioned, is plumbing tools. Plumbing tools only, not intended to be used manually. But there are some goodies in there if you really want to dive into the deep stuff that it comes with it. So there is a bunch of command line tools, and these are the tools that the sequence is running in the back end when you do MDT and config manager deployments. But there are a lot of other tools as well that are never used by MDT or config manager. We still have image manager, who used to be or have the worst interface ever created for an application. This is the authoring tool for NA10 files, and still is. Windows 10 is still using NA10 files. The next one changed name recently. Windows Imaging and Configuration Designer. They changed it now to just Imaging and Configuration Designer. Because they figured out that if you do the acronym of it, and you try to pronounce it, it becomes wicked, which apparently the lawyers or marketing didn't like at Microsoft, but I kept it here because I like it, wicked. You have the Windows Performance Toolkit. It's been part of the ADK for a long time. You have the App Compat Kit that I'll demonstrate later that will help you debug and troubleshoot and also do software inventory of your existing machines to figure out if those applications actually have even remotely a chance to work with Windows 10. And then, of course, there is also some servicing tools available and also the volume activation management tool. But enough of that. Let's dive in to demonstrate some of these tools. So first of all, when you install ADK, I'm just going to kill this for now. Go back to my server. The setup will run differently or look differently depending on if you actually run it on a client or a server. So in here, I have downloaded ADK. I have downloaded 15.11 version of ADK, which works great with MDT Light Touch and absolutely breaks everything in Config Manager. So for Config Manager, you use the first one, which is the 10.240 build. For Light Touch, you use the 15.11 build, or 10.586. Anyway, when you run the setup, I've already run it once, but this is where you can see what components that you can install. When you run this on a client, there will be another one that is available. Let me just fire up Zoom it. Usually keep it around somewhere. Here we go. Nice. There will be one here that says Assessment Services Client. This is for doing automated tests of performance. This is typically done by OEMs and not by enterprises. But the following tools are the one that we use for deployment. So for example, when you install this, it will install into 32-bit app folder, program files 32-bit, kits 10, and this is where you see the all the subfolders. And documentation is quite interesting because if you go into the documentation folder, you find a PowerShell script and a certificate and a batch file. That's the documentation. They moved it online, so it's available on TechNet. So it's not included in the ADK kit at all anymore. But let's dive into some of the folders here. For example, in the deployment kit, this is where we have WinPE, Windows PE 10. And this you can use to create your own custom boot images that you can use for troubleshooting. There is a tool set or a Windows setup folder. This is the Windows setup files that you can use to run a simulation of the setup. Doesn't include the Vim file, but just the setup files. So this is a smaller folder compared with a 3 gig download of Windows 10 or 2.5, whatever it is. But it still is the setup component. You have a whole tool set, deployment tools. So for example, you have an editor for BCD files. You have the latest version of DISM. And it's required that you use this version to run Windows servicing for Windows 10 or offline servicing for Windows 10 or to add stuff into your boot images. So to give you an example, this is server 2012 R2. If I open up an elevated command prompt and run DISM, if I can type DISM, you will see that the DISM version is the server version of DISM. This will not work for WinP 10 or for Windows 10. Instead, you open up the imaging and design or imaging tools environment, which is just another command prompt. Control-Shift-Enter for elevation. And now if I run DISM, you will see I'm on the right version of DISM. Because this command prompt, the only thing that is different, it actually sets the path to the latest version of DISM. It's not the end of the world if you forget about this, because I can promise you the DISM command will let you know that it's not capable of servicing the Windows 10 image and basically say to you, hey, use a later version, please. Well, it's not that polite either, but it tells you to use a later version. And then you need to open up the other tool set and you run it. Other tools in here is this one. This is an extremely nice utility. It's been around for a long, long time. It's used to create ISO files. So you can create bootable ISO files with it, or just ISO files in general if you want to store files, so you can mount it in a VM. There is a WMCast utility that I'll come back to later, but this is a client for multicast. And you can do some pretty cool things with this client. All right. But let's start with something simple. Let's start to create a Windows 10 boot image. A Windows PE image. So I will open this one again, and I will run the make winp command. Copy PE command. It's make winp media. That's a different batch file. The architecture and the output folder. So NIC and WinPE 64-bit. And it creates now a boot image into that folder. Now, of course, I can mount it and do some changes to it. And I can either use ImageX is still around, I can use DISM to mount it, and I can use PowerShell to mount it. So here I happen to have some example PowerShell commands that will mount the boot image. So I will change the folder to some variables. Here I set some variables. This is basically just setting the path to all the different tools. So for example, this will be my ADK path to where I have the tools. If I run the DISM path, you will see that's the, whoops, not debugging, thank you, the path to the DISM tool. Because in this folder here, this is where you have all the, can you just mark it, please? This is where you have all the extra components for Windows PE. PowerShell, .NET, scripting, HDA support, storage components, scripting, things like that. And you can simply use PowerShell to drive the DISM command. There is an add package command as well in PowerShell. It's not named that, but it doesn't work very well. DISM is more reliable. So that's why I'm calling DISM from within the PowerShell script. And of course, I can simply add these components. But I do need to mount it first. So mount, Windows image, image path, NIC media sources boot vim index. Can have multiple indexes, 1, and the folder in question. Whoops. mount. And just for the record, mount is currently an empty folder. But I run this command, and you need to be elevated when you run this command. And I'm not. So let's do this and do this right. Mount it again. You are not mounted. If that happens, there is a cleanup command for dism. dism/cleanup vim, which can be helpful to clean out existing junk. In this case, invisible junk. This is basically me running this demo before. So, all right, hopefully it cleaned it out. And I can try to run this again. Are you kidding me? All right, I can troubleshoot this later. Mount 1. There is guaranteed no folder in mount 1. I have actually seen that, especially when updating deployment shares in MDT, that after running the cleanup, the dism cleanup, you actually have to reboot the server for it to unlock all the files. So I'm assuming that's the case, but I didn't want to do that right now. So now I have mounted my Vim file, so I will change this folder. And now I should be able to inject components to it by running this command. So this is now calling dism to inject other additional components into the boot image. And then I simply commit the changes. So I need to add in the save switch to actually save the changes. Should be good. Yeah, come on. Bloody Explorer, sorry. It's still a bit sensitive to open files. Let me see if I can do some creative things here. Commit probably succeeded, so I can simply run this mount without it. To close it. This is fun. Here we go. Now, what I also can do now, since I have created a WinP media, I can create an ISO file of it. So I can use the make WinP media. I can specify /ISO. I need to specify the path. NIC something. And where I want my ISO to be stored. So NIC ISO demo something. And it now creates a bootable ISO out of that folder. In the backend, this script is actually calling the OSD image command. So now I can simply copy that ISO to my host and mount it in a VM, and I can try it out. So in combination with PowerShell and the dism commandlets, you can basically create your own custom images, which can be useful for debugging. But I use this utility a lot. As I mentioned, what if you have a folder? You have an extra files folder with some stuff in it, or you have a demo folder containing some files. You want an ISO file of that. Well, OCD img, you select the file system, and the one you want to select is this one, UDF file system, because then you can create really large ISOs. And you simply specify the folder, e:demo, and the ISO file, demo.iso. And it spits back an ISO. Didn't like one of the files in that folder. How about this one? It's not doing very well. Demo2.iso. We have an ISO. But again, it's a simple utility to do this. The other utility I mentioned that was in the ADK was the MCross Client. And you can do some pretty creative things with that. Many, many years ago, I had a blog site or a blog that was named Deploy Vista. And I had an issue where I needed to download a bunch of files to classroom machines, and they were really large files. They were 50, 60 gigs in size, and the network at that point in time, this is 2007, 2008, was pretty crappy. So I wanted to use multicast, so I figured out a way to do that. So let's see, Extreme. I put together a blog post called Extreme Deployment, where I have summarized every technique that I know of to transfer really large files over a LAN, over a network. And in one of those links, there is the link to the MCross client, which again is my old blog. So the way this works, on your deployment server, you simply need to install Windows Deployment Services. And what I've done here is I have created a namespace in WDS for a folder. The way the command looks like is this. WDS util, new namespace, really large files, and it's the really large files folder. That's how it works. Now what I can do on a client, I can go to, say, PC number 5, which is a Windows 10 machine, and log in to the domain with the right password. I can open up a command prompt and try to run the MCross client. Can't find it. You need to install the ADK component, and you need to open up the imaging tools and command thing window, because that's where you have the MCross client. So what I can do now is adjust the font a little bit and colors. And I can request that file over the network through multicast. So before running this, if I go back to my console on the server, open my console here, you can see there are currently no client activity in my namespace. But if I run this one, it's going to request that file. And if I go back to my server, you will now see it's actually starting to transfer that file. but using multicast. So meaning if you have more clients requesting the same file, it will now connect to the same stream and really utilize the network in the best way. So that's one way of dealing with it. So I'm just going to kill this for now. I'm going to disconnect it, and of course the client's going to be upset. Can you please just refresh? Thank you. Here we go. And now it's gone. And now the transfer is dead. Another way, it's a little bit outside of ADK, but I think it's still cool. Think of this. You can actually use Torrent to transfer files on your network. There is quite many different ways of doing this, but it's useful. Another thing you can do, which is also, I think, extremely cool, and this was something I ran into when going to New York for a job. I was supposed to do a training, and I had a bunch of VMs with me, I thought. I didn't. They were back in Sweden, and I was in New York. Those VMs were 183 gigs in size, and I needed to download them to the hotel in New York. And I don't know how many of you that frequently stays at hotels, but I can tell you 200 gigs of content is really stretching the hotel Wi-Fi a bit. So what I put together back then was a PowerShell script that creates the VTX file and add deduplication on it. It's a feature in Windows Server. So what I basically did, I created the VTX file and I optimized it using dedup. So it shrank these files from that to that. Because when you have a bunch of VMs, many of the files in it are exactly the same. And dedup works, it actually uses block sizes to figure that one out. And then I 7-zip that one further. I tried a few different compressions for 7-zip, and it turned out to be about 15 gigs in size or 16 gigs in size. There is another hack you can know about as well, but I think it's cool. It's called CPAC. It's an open source compression thing. It's 7-zip, but it does dedup on the files. Whatever you do, do not run this utility on a volume that is deduplicated by Windows dedup. It'll be a surprise for you. The archive will be corrupt. But assuming you don't have that, for example, you have a Windows 10 machine, you just run the utility and create the archive. And it's a dedup archive. If you need to transfer 1,000 VMs, dedup them first, copy them, and unpack them on the other end. Super fast. It takes about 10 minutes to do this archive. Boom. Or 15. It's pretty cool. The end result was 16. From 100 to 16. Pretty good. And open source is nice. Now, back to the ADK, back to provisioning packages. When you install ADK, you get the imaging and configuration designer. I'm going to create a new project or provision package. I will call it NIC Demo 1. And I will store it in my, let's see, provision packages folder. Using the same name. Now, this utility or this tool, this authoring tool for packages is requires hardware acceleration to be really behaving nicely. And in this case, I'm using remote desktop to use it, so it's actually quite slow. As you will see it go into a non-responding state many times. But this is where you select what type of Windows editions you want to create a package for. I'm going to do it for Windows Desktop Edition, and that means Windows 10, everything but mobile, really. I can import an existing one, but I'm just going to create a new one. So this is where I can start to add in settings. So for example, under accounts, computer account, this is where I can assign computer names, OUs, etc. It goes into a non-responding, and you count to 4, 5, and you can continue to work with it. Not responding. It does that for every click, by the way. It's a feature. Anyway, they added something really nice, Microsoft, in the 15.11 version of this tool, and that is provisioning commands. So you can add packages here. In this case, I'm going to add in Adobe Reader that I have here. And add it. And I'm going to add in a command line. MSI exec dash. It's coming. Dash I, the MSI dash Q, whatever the silent switches are. And when I'm done with that, I'll simply export the package. IT admin, I can encrypt it, I can have a certificate to sign it, but I'm going to export it to that folder. And I will build it. Done. Now I can go to a Windows 10 client, and this only works for Windows 10, by the way. And this one I'm going to get rid of. I will go to that server, and just to show you, there is no Adobe Reader here at all. But I'll go to my demo folder, provisioning packages, NIC demo, and I will simply double-click the package. Is this something you trust? Yes, no. Yes, I do trust it. And it will now run in the background, doing the setup of Adobe Reader. So if I open up Task Manager, I will actually see that eventually it starts off the MSI exec installer and does something with it. So hopefully shortly we'll have Adobe Reader installed. I should get a shortcut on the desktop, and it should show up in this one. If the operation that you added in your package require a reboot, like if you set a computer name or something, it does the reboot. There is no click OK to reboot, it's just reboots after a little while. So be careful for that. But now you can see Adobe Reader was installed, and it was also added in here. Now, if I would go ahead and uninstall Adobe Reader, I could not reinstall it again using the same package, because Windows remember what provisioning packages that you have installed. So you actually have to first remove the provisioning packages, and removing the package will not undo the settings. It just prevents it from being installed again. It will remove some setting, but not all of them. It will certainly not remove Adobe Reader. So I need to remove the package, and Adobe Reader is still here. And then I go ahead and uninstall Adobe Reader. And life is good. So you can do this in Config Manager as well. The new enrollment capabilities in Config Manager actually creates provisioning packages for you. Basically calling the same component as this utility does. The only limited set though, but still. So what else do we have? Well, I did mention that the volume activation tool is still in there to manage licenses. This is version 3.1 of the utility. It does require a database. And when you install ADK, it tries to install SQL Express 2012. Don't do that. Download and install SQL Express 2014 SB1. And when you do that, make sure to name the instance ADK. because then the ADK setup will figure that one out and automatically use it. So that's pretty nice. Now, back to ADK tools. There is a application compatibility manager. It's been around since, the first Windows Vista and Windows 7 projects, migration projects. But with this tool, you can create an inventory package. So you create a new package, NIC inventory, and they actually fixed the label issue in 15.11. Prior to 15.11, you actually had to type in a label for it to actually work. But what this does is actually creates a small MSI file that you can put somewhere in my act packages folder. And then I can go to a client, in this case PC number 5. I can find that package, and I can simply run it. It supports silent installs as well. So now what happens in the back end, it actually does a scanning of this machine and does a software inventory. It's calling the Inject component to do that work. Eventually you will see it actually deletes that process and goes ahead and calls an uploader instead, because there was a logs container on this server. It will spit back the result eventually for me. So give this a second to run. Dum 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 dum. It's coming. It's scanning the machine. Not very quickly. Come on. Well, we allow this to run for a bit. If I go back to the server, I already run this on PC number 2 before. So if you go back to the console, you can actually see that I have been scanning. It actually came that machine right now. Good. Yeah, the bucketizer is done. Okay, fine. It got the inventory back on the server. And it also now have all the applications listed that it found on these machines. And if I enable internet access by starting up my trustworthy Linux router, it's a virtual router based on Viara, a Linux distribution, but I use that to give my VMs internet access on all sorts of weird networks. It's just a router with four network cards in it, but it's extremely lightweight. So if I go back to the server, verify that I have internet access. Yes, I do. I can send and receive information about these applications. So I will sync that information with Microsoft, and I will get a report back whether Microsoft thinks and the community thinks that this information actually will work, or these applications will work in Windows 10. Yeah, come on. You can do this. So, you can see that some of these applications, they have information, both from Microsoft, from the vendor, but also from the community, where people actually said, all right, this appears to work. And the idea is here that if you find an application where the community has 100 people saying that the app will work, it probably will work. If there will be a report saying from 100 people that it didn't work, I will probably not spend too much time trying to get it to work in Windows 10. But what you can do still, even with Windows 10, you can still fix broken apps. You can still configure Windows to lie to the application. The most common use example is the good old stock viewer application that came from back in the Vista days. This is a broken app. When you try to run the app, it complains, permission denied. When you try to do things like save things in preferences, it breaks and say, oh, can't do this. But this is an app that is intended to be broken. And I remember talking to Chris Jackson about it. He had a hard time getting this one certified so he can actually allow it to be on the download Microsoft or Microsoft download site. Because the review board would say, this is broken. And he would go, yeah, it's intended to be broken. So, but he finally made it through. So you can download this and play around with it. But the thing is, when you have applications that doesn't work in Windows 10, you can actually go to the installation folder for ADK or for where you installed ADK. And you go to the app compat. Where did you go, my friend? Here we go. You go to the standard user analyzer and you open that utility. And you launch the app through that utility. So I will launch Stock Viewer using that tool set. And now it will record everything I do in this utility and provide you with, when I close it, with fixes. One for namespace and one for objects. And you can either apply those fixes and create a shim file out of it, or you can export it to an MSI file so you can deploy those fixes out to other Windows 10 machines. And of course you still have the analyzer in where you can review all the existing fixes that comes with Windows for all the various applications that are about a bunch of them, really. 500 known breaks or fixes already in Windows 10. And you can extend it with your own, and then you deploy this to your image or at deployment time. So you can still have Windows here, the app here, and a shim in between that lies to Windows or lies to the application. So when an application wants something, you can say, you're good to go. Just have fun. All right. So what about the integration with MDT and Config Manager then? So why is it useful to know these tools? Well, debugging purposes, obviously. A good example is driver injection. How does it do it? Well, the sequence will copy the driver to the C drive. C:drivers for MDT, packages folder for config manager. It will call dism from the ADK to stage the driver into the driver store. And eventually it will call on setup to install the driver. Obviously, there is no point for you guys to troubleshoot these two steps if the driver was never copied. But assuming it was copied, you can actually, if you have issues, you can actually review the dism log file to see why it could not stage that driver into the store, which most likely mean that the driver is broken. And if that happens, you now know that, of course, dism is a component from ADK, so you can run dism manually and try to do these things and see if something pops up on you when you try to do that operation. You can't do much about setup, but of course you can review the setup log file and things like that. But again, knowing the command line tools in the back end helps you do things. Many moons ago, I put together a blog post around it was one of the previews. Let's see. Yeah. Beyond unsupported, deploying Windows 10 preview using Config Manager, and this was the time where Config Manager did not have support for Windows 10. But I figured out that I can steal the dism file from a Windows 10 box and have the sequence use them at deployment time. So I simply added a very advanced command to my sequence. copy this folder to my WinPE. At deployment times, I'm copying the latest binaries. So why do I tell you this? I mentioned before that do not use 15.11 version of ADK with config manager because it's broken. On the good side is the first version, the 10.240 version, is also broken in the way it cannot run PowerShell scripts if you pixie booted the boot image. You can't run PowerShell scripts in it. If you boot from an ISO or USB stick, you can, but not if you pixie boot the same boot image. So you can't use that one to run PowerShell, and you can't use this one at all with config manager. But what you can do, and this is not in any means supported, you can actually import an older boot image into config manager. And you can use this technique to download the latest Inject Components. And this way you can actually do run PowerShell in Windows PE for config manager. So if you run into an issue where you have a PowerShell-based front end, you update to WinPE 10, you upgrade to ADK 10, and it doesn't work anymore, and you don't want to wait another 2 months until Microsoft publishes the hotfix for it or the new version of ADK, this is a temporary workaround for it. So that should be fun. But other than that, knowing what the config manager and MDT platform is actually doing in the backend is extremely useful. For example, the migration tools. I mean, the default sequences, both in Light Touch and in config manager, there will be an action in those sequences that will drive the backup. At some point. Here. And there is a similar one for config manager. But what is really being happening here behind the scenes? Well, config manager is calling scan state. Scan state exe with a bunch of command line switches. And the restore later will do a load state. And knowing these commands is absolutely critical when you troubleshoot migration jobs. Someone is not very happy about Windows 10 deployments, I can tell. But the thing is, this allows you to be quite efficient when you troubleshoot things. For example, if you want to create custom templates for the backup, how do you test them? Do you want to add them to config manager? Do you want to add them to MDT and do full deployment just because you want to try out the new template? No. You want to save time by simply finding the worst user in the company and run a backup from that user. Because that user is most likely to have junk on the machines. You want live data from a machine. Then you deploy a VM with your corporate image. And you run scan state or load state manually to restore that backup. And you verify if your template worked. If it didn't, well, restore the VM to a snapshot, fix the template, another backup, another restore. This way you can simply work through them pretty quickly until you nail that template. And then you add it to MDT, then you add it to config manager, update the packages and try it in production. But again, knowing the command lines is actually quite critical. That being said, I have 2 more things to talk about. And first of all, there are a bunch of resources available for deployment information, books, videos, trainings, whatever. And I do not mean you should steal things. The stealing with pride volume, it's a metaphor for not reinventing the wheel, but we thought it was a cool pirate ship to have on the book page. And also I have a friend here, Microsoft MVP, Mr. Olaf Twitt. He has an extremely warm heart for a foundation, the Save the Children Foundation, so I promised I will add this to my slide deck as well. And these slides will obviously be available for download too. As usual, these sessions are recorded, so if you want to review any of the demos, you will be able to do that eventually when they come available. But by that, it's soon weekend. It's Friday, after all. Thank you, guys.